Under the vaulted ceilings of the grand ballroom, lights spilled from the crystal chandeliers like 1,000 tiny suns. The royal gala was not just another event on the palace calendar. It was the kind of evening where every glance, every smile, and every word carried the weight of history. The air itself seemed to hum with a mixture of anticipation and unspoken tension. Across the room, gowns shimmered, diamonds caught the light, and men in tailored suits shifted slightly in their polished shoes, whispering to their companions about the speeches, the guests, and the delicate dance of royal diplomacy that was about to unfold. At the far end of the room, Queen Camilla sat poised, her expression an unreadable mask of regal composure. She had been here before, figuratively and literally. Decades of scrutiny, whispers, and outright scandal had forged in her a skill for appearing untouchable. To the untrained eye, her calm demeanor was reassuring. To those who knew the unending undercurrents of the monarchy, it was a shield. Tonight, however, there was a current running through the hall that even she could not predict. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Princess Charlotte, just 9 years old, was seated between her parents. The youngest in the room to hold a title, and yet one of the most closely watched. She had always been regarded by the public as the perfect balance of her mother's elegance and her father's quiet strength. She had attended her share of formal gatherings before, but tonight felt different. She could sense it in the way her father's hand occasionally brushed hers, in the quiet but constant glances her mother gave her, and in the way Camilla's eyes seemed to rest on her for a fraction longer than on anyone else. The gala had been planned for months, an occasion to celebrate charitable milestones and to reinforce the image of unity within the royal family. The speech lineup was carefully curated. Senior royals, respected dignitaries, and a handful of public figures whose reputations could withstand the scrutiny of such an evening. The expectation was that Charlotte would be seen, not heard, a symbol of the monarchy's future, present only to remind the audience that the institution had a new generation waiting in the wings. But sometimes, history isn't shaped by plans. It's shaped by moments. Earlier in the evening, Charlotte had overheard a brief conversation in one of the antechambers. It was the kind of offhand remark that adults often assume children won't notice, but she did. A senior aide, speaking in hushed tones, mentioned how important it was for Her Majesty Camilla to be front and center tonight, as a way of solidifying her public image. There was a subtle but unmistakable implication that the night was less about charity and more about reinforcing Camilla's reign. Something in those words had tightened Charlotte's chest. She thought of the photographs she had seen of her grandmother Diana, the videos of her visiting hospitals, the stories her father had shared about her warmth and fearlessness. She thought of how many people, strangers to her but fiercely loyal to Diana's memory, still carried a sense of loss and injustice. It wasn't the first time Charlotte had felt the shadow of her grandmother's absence. She had asked her father once, while they were looking through old family albums, why Diana had never been queen. William had paused, his eyes briefly clouding before he explained, in the simplest way possible, that life had been unfair to her. Charlotte didn't fully understand the politics, but she understood the feeling behind the words. She understood that someone deeply loved by her father and admired by millions had been denied something she seemed destined for. As the evening wore on, speeches flowed one after another. Camilla delivered hers flawlessly, a careful blend of formal gratitude, acknowledgement of the cause at hand, and just enough personal touch to seem relatable. The applause was warm, but Charlotte noticed that her father clapped a little slower than the others. Then came an unexpected moment. A member of the event committee, perhaps caught in the whimsy of showcasing the next generation, announced that Princess Charlotte would be invited to say a few words. At first, there was a ripple of polite surprise. Cameras shifted. Photographers leaned forward. William's eyebrows rose slightly, and Kate's lips pressed together in the way they did when she was silently calculating the best course of action. Charlotte stood, her heart thudding in her chest. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room on her. She walked to the podium, her small frame dwarfed by the ornate structure. The microphone was adjusted down for her, and she gripped the edges with a steadying breath. She began innocently enough, thanking the guests, acknowledging the cause they were here to support. Her voice was clear, her posture straight, and her delivery confident in the way that only someone unburdened by years of public criticism could manage. But then, there was a shift. She paused, glanced toward her father, then toward Camilla. The room seemed to grow quieter, the kind of silence that signals not just attention, but anticipation. In that pause, Charlotte felt the weight of her grandmother's story pressing against her thoughts. She felt the image of Diana, not as a title, but as a person, and the injustice of what she had been denied. And though she had not planned it, though no one could have anticipated it, the words formed in her mind with a clarity that left no room for hesitation. This was the moment. She looked directly at Camilla. The stillness of the room was absolute. "My grandma Diana deserved to be queen," she said, her voice unwavering. "Not you." The words didn't echo in the traditional sense, but they reverberated all the same, in the gasps that escaped from the audience, in the sharp intake of breath from someone near the front row, in the imperceptible stiffening of Camilla's shoulders. The statement hung in the air like a physical presence, unyielding and undeniable. William's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't move. Kate's lips parted, then pressed shut again. For a heartbeat, Camilla did not blink, did not shift, did not breathe in any visible way. And then the cameras clicked, rapid, relentless. No one in that room knew exactly what would come of that moment, but they knew it was historic. This was no scripted rebellion, no carefully worded political statement. It was the unfiltered truth of a child who had seen enough to form her own conviction and was unafraid to speak it aloud. The audience didn't erupt, nor did they return immediately to polite applause. There was only that heavy, loaded silence, the kind that could make or break reputations in the span of a few seconds. Somewhere in that stillness, Charlotte turned away from the microphone and walked back to her seat, her chin slightly lifted, her pace measured. The rest of the evening would continue, as it always did, but nothing about it would be the same. Every conversation after that would carry the weight of what had just been said. Every news headline in the morning would be about the princess who dared to speak for a grandmother she never met. What no one knew in that instant was how deep the ripple would go, through the palace, through the media, through the public's collective memory. And perhaps most of all, through the quiet, unspoken corridors of a family that had spent decades trying to bury some truths, only to have them laid bare in the most public of ways. That night, the gala was supposed to be about celebration. Instead, it became the night a 9-year-old girl made history. The event was held at the palace's state ballroom, a venue so steeped in history that each gilded panel and every ornate chandelier had witnessed centuries of power plays, whispered conspiracies, and moments that shaped the monarchy. Guests arrived in a steady stream of luxury cars, stepping onto the crimson carpet as photographers' flashes lit the night like intermittent lightning. Outside the palace gates, small crowds gathered, some waving Union Jacks, others holding placards that read, "Diana Forever," in gold paint. Even before stepping inside, the shadow of the late Princess Diana was present, her legacy woven into the evening's atmosphere like a faint but persistent melody. Inside, the ballroom was a sea of polished faces, royal family members, foreign dignitaries, political leaders, influential philanthropists, and carefully selected celebrities. The seating was arranged in concentric arcs facing the raised stage, with the royal table at the center front. Camilla sat between King Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall's closest confidant, her posture upright, her gaze moving methodically across the room as if cataloging each person's presence. William and Kate flanked Charlotte on either side, an unspoken protective wall. The evening's theme was heritage and hope, chosen to highlight the monarchy's ongoing commitment to its charitable endeavors while symbolizing its adaptation for the future. Yet to anyone who paid attention to the undercurrents of royal affairs, it was also a subtle nod to the importance of public perception, a reminder that heritage could be selectively remembered and hope could be carefully curated. There was a procession of formalities before the program began. The master of ceremonies, a seasoned broadcaster with a warm but authoritative voice, welcomed the attendees. The orchestra swelled softly in the background as the national anthem was played, followed by polite applause. The opening speech, given by a prominent charity figure, praised the royal family's enduring role in social causes. Cameras were fixed on the king and Camilla, capturing every gracious nod and every moment of applause for the broadcast that would later be edited for public release. Camilla's speech was scheduled midway through the evening. Before her turn came, several high-profile figures took the stage: an environmental advocate with a stirring presentation on conservation, a decorated veteran recounting the impact of royal-supported rehabilitation programs, and a celebrated scientist discussing groundbreaking medical research funded by royal patronage. Each speaker ended with an obligatory nod to the Queen Consort, subtly reinforcing her central role in the narrative of the evening. When Camilla finally rose, the room seemed to sharpen in focus. She began with a gracious acknowledgement of the cause and its beneficiaries, her voice carrying the polished rhythm of someone accustomed to public speaking. She made brief jokes to lighten the mood, carefully chosen to be harmless but relatable. Her anecdotes drew on her experiences visiting charities and meeting everyday citizens. To the untrained ear, it was a flawless performance, diplomatic, warm, and laced with just enough humility to seem approachable. But there was an unmistakable undercurrent. This was not just about charity. It was about cementing her image as an indispensable part of the monarchy. Charlotte sat silently, her eyes moving between the speaker and her father. William's expression was polite but restrained, his applause measured. Kate's focus was steady, her hands resting in her lap in that graceful stillness she had mastered. There was no sign that the calm surface would soon give way to a tidal shift. After Camilla concluded, the applause rolled through the room like a controlled wave, loud enough to be respectful, brief enough to signal a readiness to move on. The next segment was lighter, featuring a brief orchestral interlude, while servers glided through the aisles refilling glasses. Conversations resumed in low tones, punctuated by occasional laughter. It was during this interval that Charlotte caught snippets of the adult discussions swirling around her. One guest at the next table remarked on how remarkably well Camilla had handled the evening, calling it a victory for her public standing. Another added, with a knowing smile, that such moments were vital for ensuring history remembers the right details. These words stayed with Charlotte, though she gave no outward sign. She took a sip of her sparkling water, her eyes fixed on the stage as the master of ceremonies announced an unexpected addition to the program. In a gesture meant to symbolize the future of the monarchy, they would invite one of its youngest and brightest members to say a few words. The choice was deliberate, the timing ideal for a heartwarming close to the formal portion of the evening. The announcement drew warm applause, though there was a brief flicker of surprise across William's face. Kate leaned slightly toward her daughter, giving her a small, encouraging smile. Charlotte rose, smoothed her dress, and followed an usher toward the podium. Her footsteps were steady, her expression composed, but her mind was moving quickly. She had prepared nothing for this moment. What she carried instead was a sense of truth she had been piecing together for years, shaped by family stories, public whispers, and her own quiet observations. As she approached the microphone, the hall seemed to grow still, not from a lack of movement, but from a collective awareness that this was a rare, unscripted moment. Her small hands gripped the edges of the podium. She began with gratitude, thanking the guests, the organizers, and the charities involved. Her voice was clear, each word measured. A murmur of admiration moved through the crowd at her poise. But then her tone shifted, just slightly, enough for those who knew her to recognize that she was about to veer from the expected. She paused, scanning the faces in front of her. The king's gaze was fixed on her, Camilla's expression neutral, William's encouraging but wary. The silence between her words was heavy, almost palpable. When she spoke again, her words cut through the air with disarming precision. She looked directly at Camilla and delivered the line that would define the night. "My grandma Diana deserved to be queen, not you." The reaction was immediate but muted, a collective intake of breath rather than an eruption. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, others stared straight ahead, unwilling to acknowledge the breach of protocol. Camilla's hands, folded neatly in her lap, did not move, but her jaw tightened ever so slightly. William's eyes darted toward the king, whose face remained a mask of studied control. Charlotte did not elaborate. She let the statement stand, unsoftened by apology or explanation. Then, with the same calm composure, she thanked the audience once more and stepped down from the podium. The gala continued, But the mood had changed. Conversations grew quieter, glances more frequent. The orchestra played, but even the music seemed unable to dispel the charged air. And while the rest of the program unfolded according to plan, the true event, the one that would dominate headlines and dinner table debates for weeks, had already happened. By the time the final toast was made, the public facade was intact, but beneath it, something had shifted irrevocably. The gala of the year had transformed into the night a child's truth pierced the armor of royal decorum, leaving everyone present to wonder what ripples it would send through the palace walls in the days to come. Princess Diana was more than a royal. She was a phenomenon. Her image was woven into the fabric of British life. Her compassion for the sick and the marginalized, her defiance in the face of royal protocol when it clashed with human decency, her openness with emotions in a world that prized reserve. She was also a woman who had been, in the public's view, wronged. In the years following her untimely death in 1997, her legend only grew. For millions around the world, Diana had been the people's queen in every way except in title. Charlotte had grown up surrounded by this legacy, though it came to her indirectly. There were no long conversations about the scandalous divorce, no details about betrayals or affairs. William and Kate shielded their children from that darkness. But there were bedtime stories about kindness, about the time Diana sat on the floor of a hospital ward to talk to a frightened child, about how she used her position to make invisible people visible. There were photographs and albums, Diana laughing with William as a boy, walking barefoot on a beach, greeting crowds with a genuine smile that needed no practice. What Charlotte absorbed from these fragments was a sense that Diana had been both royal and relatable, powerful yet human. The gulf between that image and her experiences with Camilla was stark. While Camilla could perform graciousness in public, her relationship with the younger royals was formal at best. Charlotte was polite, as she had been taught, but there was no warmth in those exchanges. It was cordial distance, not connection. Diana's story was also a story of loss, not just for her family, but for the institution itself. Historians and royal correspondents often mused on how different the monarchy's trajectory might have been had she lived. Some believed her presence could have softened the public's perception of the royals, making them seem more accessible and emotionally attuned. Others argued she might have reshaped the institution entirely, modernizing it in ways that could have prevented future crises. This "what if" hovered over every public appearance of the new generation, an invisible comparison they never asked for but could never escape. For Charlotte, Diana was a symbol as much as a person, someone whose absence she felt in strange ways. She once asked her father, after a schoolmate mentioned seeing a statue of Diana in the palace gardens, why her grandmother was so famous if she wasn't queen. William's pause before answering spoke volumes. He told her gently that her grandmother had done things no queen had ever done, even without the title, but that sometimes life and fate are not fair. Those words stayed with her, not because she fully grasped their political implications, but because they carried an emotional truth she could feel. In her young mind, fairness was a simple concept. If someone was loved and respected, if they worked hard and cared for people, they should be recognized. That her grandmother had been denied the role seemed like a wrong that had never been righted. In the weeks leading up to the gala, reminders of Diana's legacy had been unusually visible. The anniversary of her death had just passed, bringing with it a flurry of media retrospectives. Old footage was played on television, clips of Diana shaking hands with AIDS patients, embracing landmine victims, laughing with children. Newspapers reprinted black and white portraits, her eyes luminous even on cheap newsprint. Charlotte had seen these images in passing, and though she didn't comment on them, they lingered. There were also subtle tensions within the family that she had begun to notice, though no one spelled them out. She sensed her father's unease around Camilla, the way he kept interactions civil but brief. She noticed how her mother sometimes seemed to position herself between Charlotte and Camilla during public events, as if to shield her from some unseen discomfort. And she had overheard snippets, half-sentences exchanged between staff, that hinted at a history far more complicated than the polite public facade suggested. Camilla, for her part, had spent decades working to rehabilitate her image, to move from the role of the other woman in Diana's marriage to that of a respected queen consort. For many Britons, she had succeeded. For others, no amount of charity work or polished speeches could erase the past. That divide in public opinion was a fault line running through the monarchy, and Charlotte, though young, could feel it beneath her feet. The Gala's theme of heritage and hope seemed almost ironic to those aware of these dynamics. Heritage meant remembering the past, but whose version of the past? Hope meant looking forward, but toward what kind of monarchy? For the palace, the evening was an opportunity to present a united front, to show continuity from past to future without dwelling on the uncomfortable middle chapters. For Charlotte, it was a stage on which the absence of her grandmother loomed as large as the chandeliers. As she sat listening to the speeches that night, Charlotte's thoughts drifted to the countless people who still spoke of Diana with love, the strangers who left flowers at her memorial every year, the friends of her father who smiled wistfully when they recalled her. She thought of how Diana had been denied the role that Camilla now occupied, and how, in the quiet arithmetic of a child's moral compass, that felt wrong. She didn't yet understand that the monarchy thrives on the careful management of narrative. What she understood was loyalty, and in her heart, that loyalty belonged to the grandmother she'd never met. This context, this deep, unshakable shadow of Diana, is what made her words at the podium more than a childish outburst. It was why, when she looked at Camilla and spoke her truth, the room reacted not as though a child had been inappropriate, but as though a dormant truth had been dragged into the light. It was a moment decades in the making, built on memories, absences, and the lingering echo of a life cut short. For those who witnessed it, the statement was not simply about the woman it named. It was about the unresolved question that had haunted the monarchy since 1997. Who should have worn the crown beside Charles? Charlotte had answered, not with political calculation, but with the clarity only youth can summon. And so, even before the applause or the whispers began, those in the room knew the impact was seismic. This was not just a comment at a gala. It was a reminder that the past was not buried, and that even the youngest voices in the royal family could carry it forward into the present. Charlotte was a child born into a family where history was not just something you read about in books. It was something you walked through every day. The walls of Kensington Palace were lined with portraits and artifacts, each carrying stories that the adults around her seemed to half share and half guard. Growing up, she learned early that there were certain names and topics that shifted the air in the room when spoken. Diana was one of them. From the time she was old enough to understand simple family trees, Charlotte knew that her father's mother had died before she was born. The first time she saw a picture of Diana, she had pointed out the smile, saying it was just like Papa's. William had smiled at that, but his eyes had softened in a way Charlotte recognized as something deeper than happiness. Later, Kate began telling her stories, not the tabloid scandals, but the little moments that revealed Diana's heart. How she used to sneak her boys out for fast food when palace meals felt too formal. How she would stop her car to help someone struggling on the side of the road. How she loved to hug people even when the cameras were rolling. These stories painted a vivid image in Charlotte's mind. Her grandmother was not a distant royal figure. She was someone warm and full of life, someone who seemed to care more about people than protocol. The contrast between this image and the stiffness Charlotte sometimes felt in the company of other royals was not lost on her. Over the years, Charlotte began to notice subtler things. The way her father's tone would change when Camilla's name came up, the way certain older relatives avoided mentioning Diana at official events, as if speaking her name might reopen old wounds. She didn't fully understand the intricacies of her father's complicated history with Camilla, but she could sense it in the same way a child can sense when adults are speaking around something rather than about it. School brought its own layer of awareness. While her classmates had grandparents who attended birthdays and school plays, Charlotte knew that one of hers was gone because of something that happened long before she was born. Occasionally, another child would mention Diana after seeing her face in a magazine or on television during an anniversary tribute. More than once, Charlotte had been asked, "Do you wish she was still here?" She always answered yes without hesitation, even though the question was too small for the weight it carried. There were moments when her awareness of Diana's legacy collided with her growing understanding of royal life. One summer afternoon, Charlotte accompanied her parents to an event where she overheard a member of the public call Diana the real queen. The words lodged in her mind. Later, she asked Kate why they had said that. Her mother explained gently that many people had loved Diana so deeply that they imagined her as the rightful queen, even though life had not worked out that way. That explanation was enough for the moment, but Charlotte's curiosity grew. She began asking William more questions, questions that sometimes made him pause before answering. Why did Grandma Diana not live in the palace anymore before she died? Why did people sometimes put flowers at gates? Why did some people say she was treated badly? William tried to keep the answers honest without overwhelming her, but every answer seemed to carry a thread that led to more questions. There were also moments that didn't require words at all. Charlotte had seen her father's expression when they visited Diana's memorial or stood before her statue. She had seen the way his posture changed, the way his eyes seemed to drift inward. Those visits were always followed by quiet car rides home, as if speaking might disturb something fragile. Charlotte's awareness sharpened further in the year leading up to the gala. Public commemorations of Diana's life were everywhere. Documentaries aired, showing archival footage of her walking through minefields, embracing children, laughing at events. In one clip, Diana was asked if she thought she would ever be queen. She smiled and said, "I'd like to be a queen of people's hearts." Charlotte watched that interview more than once, her young mind trying to reconcile the idea that someone so loved could be kept from the position that seemed rightfully hers. At home, Charlotte began to notice the way Camilla was presented in the media compared to the way Diana was remembered. Camilla's coverage focused on duty, charity work, and supporting the king. Diana's coverage, even decades after her death, was about connection, vulnerability, and an unshakable bond with the public. The difference was striking. Charlotte's own interactions with Camilla were polite but distant. There were no warm embraces or spontaneous laughter. Conversations were brief, often limited to formal occasions. Camilla was careful, perhaps wary of overstepping, but that caution read to Charlotte as detachment. It wasn't animosity, but it wasn't affection either. In the months before the gala, Charlotte had a private moment with William that would stay with her. She had been looking through a coffee table book of royal portraits and came across an image of Diana in a tiara, standing beside a younger Charles. She pointed at the picture and asked, "Why isn't she queen in this?" William looked at the photograph for a long moment before answering. "Because sometimes, the people who deserve something the most are the ones who are denied it." The simplicity of the answer, paired with the sadness in his voice, settled into Charlotte's mind like a stone at the bottom of a pond. She carried it quietly, turning it over in her thoughts in the weeks that followed. Her perspective was also shaped by the way the public continued to claim Diana as their own. At charity events, strangers would tell Charlotte that she reminded them of her grandmother. In her eyes, her smile, her poise. They spoke of Diana as if she were still here, as if the bond between her and the people had never been broken. Those comments were never made about Camilla. By the time the gala approached, Charlotte's sense of loyalty to her grandmother's memory had deepened into something more defined. She didn't think of herself as taking sides in a conflict. To her, it was simply telling the truth as she understood it. She believed Diana should have been queen, not because of titles or protocol, but because of the love and respect she inspired. That belief had been quietly forming in her mind for years, and though she didn't plan to voice it at the gala, it was part of her every thought as she dressed for the evening. The gown, the shoes, the formal hairstyle, all the trappings of royal presentation, felt like stepping into a role. But under the layers of satin and etiquette, Charlotte was still a girl who saw her grandmother's absence as a wrong that had never been made right. When the moment came at the gala, and the microphone was in front of her, she didn't think of the political fallout or the shock it would cause. She thought of Diana. She thought of the truth she had pieced together from photographs, stories, and the expressions her father couldn't hide. And she decided, in the most public of settings, to speak it aloud. To understand the undercurrent of tension that made Charlotte's words so explosive, it's necessary to look at the family dynamics as they stood in the months leading up to the gala. The monarchy had weathered scandals, public opinion swings, and internal disputes for decades, but the arrival of a younger generation, particularly William and Kate's children, had added a new layer of complexity. They were symbols of the future, and in the eyes of many, they were a chance to repair the wounds of the past. King Charles occupied the center of this web, the pivot point between the institution's history and its uncertain future. He had spent much of his life in the shadow of two women, his first wife, Diana, whose public popularity eclipsed his own, and Camilla, whose relationship with him was once a scandal but had since been reframed as a love story. That reframing had taken years of careful PR, but it never completely erased the original narrative in the minds of the public. Charles understood this better than anyone, and so did Camilla. Camilla's position was, and always would be, complicated. Within the family, she was respected by some, tolerated by others. She had cordial relationships with several members, but there was always a certain distance. Even in moments of shared purpose, charity events, state functions, private gatherings, there was a sense that her role had been accepted rather than embraced. For William, this was particularly true. He maintained a polite relationship with her for the sake of appearances, but there were lines that neither crossed. Kate, ever the peacemaker, navigated these waters with grace. She was warm to Camilla in public, offering smiles and light conversation, but her priority was always her children. Those who observed closely noted how she positioned herself at events, often keeping Charlotte close when Camilla was near. It was a subtle but consistent gesture, a way of maintaining boundaries without drawing attention to them. Harry's absence from most public family events added another layer to the tension. His departure from royal duties, his interviews, and his candid criticism of the monarchy had left scars that were still healing, or, in some cases, not healing at all. While his grievances were largely directed at the institution as a whole, his references to Camilla in certain interviews had stirred old debates. Even from afar, his words influenced the atmosphere within the family. For Charlotte, these dynamics weren't explained outright, but she could feel them. Children are often more perceptive than adults realize, and she noticed the subtle cues. The way her father's tone shifted in certain conversations, the careful diplomacy in her mother's answers, the moments when Camilla's presence seemed to quiet a room. There were small incidents that hinted at deeper fault lines. Months before the gala, during a private family gathering, Camilla had made a light remark about the younger generation learning the art of public speaking early. It was said with a smile, but the tone carried a hint of condescension. Charlotte, sitting nearby, caught the look her father gave in response, a polite but firm expression that ended the exchange. She didn't forget it. Another time, during preparations for a joint charity appearance, Charlotte overheard a staff member explaining to another that it was important for Camilla to be at the center of all photographs for that event. To Charlotte, who had been taught that the cause was always the focus, the idea of positioning for optics felt strange. It was another small moment that lodged in her memory. The divides within the family weren't always about open conflict. More often, they were about unspoken understandings, the knowledge of who stood where in the invisible hierarchy, who could speak freely, and who had to measure every word. Charlotte had been raised to understand that public life came with rules, but she was also a child with a strong sense of fairness. When she saw gaps between what was said and what was done, she noticed. William's relationship with his father was cordial but cautious. They worked together on public initiatives, shared the spotlight when necessary, but they rarely appeared relaxed in each other's company. The unspoken history of how Diana had been treated lingered between them. Charlotte might not have known every detail, but she could sense her father's protectiveness over her and George and Louis, as if ensuring they would never endure the same emotional toll. Kate's role as a bridge between factions was delicate. She understood the value of maintaining peace, especially for the sake of the children, but she also understood the power of loyalty. Her loyalty was to her husband and her children first. This meant that while she would never speak ill of Camilla, she would quietly shield her family from unnecessary exposure to potential tension. In the weeks before the gala, the family dynamic was strained further by media chatter. Tabloids had run features celebrating Camilla's public approval ratings, subtly framing her as the steady hand guiding the monarchy alongside the king. These articles, while complimentary to Camilla, inevitably drew comparisons to Diana, reigniting public debates. In private, those comparisons weren't discussed openly within the family, but everyone felt their presence. Charlotte, though young, had started to connect these dots. She understood that some people viewed Camilla as an outsider who had stepped into a role meant for her grandmother. She also understood that her father never quite seemed comfortable with that reality, even if he rarely said so. The gala, with its theme of heritage and hope, was meant to be a show of unity. But for those inside the family, it was also a reminder of the unresolved questions and quiet tensions that lay just beneath the polished surface. When Charlotte stood at the podium that night, she wasn't just speaking as a child. She was speaking from within this intricate web, one she had been observing her whole life, even if she couldn't articulate it in adult terms. Her words struck so deeply because they pierced the delicate balance the family had been maintaining for years. They took something everyone knew but never acknowledged in public and laid it bare in front of the world. In that instant, the unspoken became spoken, and the private became political. By the time the gala ended, the fractures in the family's unity were visible, if only to those who knew where to look. The seating arrangements had been perfect, the speeches polished, the photographs beautiful. But behind every smile was the knowledge that a child's voice had just shifted the conversation in a way no adult in that room had dared to. Preparations for the gala had been underway for months, involving dozens of staff members, event planners, communications advisors, and security personnel. Every detail had been discussed, from the color palette of the table arrangements to the sequence of speeches. The official purpose of the event was to celebrate the work of several charities under royal patronage. But those in the inner circle knew it also carried a secondary goal: to present the monarchy as united, forward-looking, and harmonious under King Charles and Queen Camilla. That narrative had to be polished to a gleam, and nothing, in theory, was left to chance. In the days leading up to the gala, William and Kate had attended a private meeting with palace staff to review the running order. Charlotte was scheduled to attend, but only in the capacity of a young royal presence. Someone to be photographed, waved at, admired for her composure. There was no formal speaking role for her, and William had no intention of putting her in that position. His priority was to shield his children from unnecessary public pressure, especially at such a young age. However, there were quiet discussions among certain aides about the possibility of involving Charlotte in some way during the evening. One suggestion, floated by a senior advisor close to Camilla's team, was that Charlotte could offer a short thank you at the end of the charity presentations, a symbolic gesture of generational continuity. The idea was presented as harmless, even endearing. But William was cautious. He politely declined, citing the need to keep the evening simple and controlled. That could have been the end of it. But in the labyrinth of palace politics, ideas have a way of resurfacing. On the afternoon before the gala, while Charlotte was being fitted for her dress, Kate overheard two staff members discussing the optics of the event. One remarked that it would be a perfect image if Camilla were seen guiding the young princess onto the stage, symbolically passing the torch. The other agreed, noting that such a moment would be front-page material and great for solidifying Camilla's standing. Kate said nothing at the time, but the conversation left her unsettled. Later that evening, over dinner at their residence, Kate mentioned it to William. His jaw tightened as she spoke. He had no interest in allowing his daughter to be used as a prop in a narrative that, to him, still carried the weight of past wounds. He told Kate they would handle the evening exactly as planned and avoid any surprises. But palace events are living things, and control is never absolute. On the day of the gala, William noticed subtle changes in the running order. A small gap had been inserted before the final toasts, a space that could easily accommodate an unscripted moment. He said nothing to Charlotte about it. He didn't want to make her anxious. Behind closed doors that afternoon, Camilla had her own preparations. According to a source close to her staff, she had been advised to keep her tone warm and inclusive during her speech, particularly toward the younger generation. This was a long-standing tactic in her public appearances, positioning herself as a mentor figure, a stabilizing presence for the monarchy's future. Whether or not she anticipated Charlotte's later words, she certainly saw the value in appearing connected to her. In the hours before the event, Charlotte had a quiet moment with her mother. Kate, adjusting the bow at the back of her daughter's dress, reminded her to be polite, smile, and represent the family with grace. Charlotte nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She had been thinking about Diana all week, about the stories, the photographs, the way people's voices softened when they spoke of her. She wasn't planning anything specific, but the sense of injustice she felt about her grandmother's absence was sharper than usual. In another part of the palace, William was reviewing his notes for his own brief remarks at the gala. He intended to keep them light, focused on the cause, with just enough warmth to remind people of his accessibility. He had long ago learned the art of speaking in a way that conveyed sincerity without revealing too much of his private thoughts. But there were moments, like when he passed a framed photograph of his mother on the mantel, when that balance felt more difficult to maintain. Security briefings were held in a separate room, mapping the entrances, exits, and flow of guests. The gala's high-profile nature meant that both visible and invisible security measures were in place. Snipers on rooftops, plainclothes officers mingling with guests, and a rapid response team stationed just out of sight. The air of elegance outside concealed a well-drilled operation. The family gathered in a private reception area before making their entrance into the ballroom. The atmosphere was a mixture of rehearsed civility and quiet watchfulness. Charles and Camilla arrived last, both in formal attire that broadcast confidence. Camilla greeted William and Kate with polite warmth and offered a small compliment to Charlotte about her dress. Charlotte thanked her, her voice polite but flat. It was a tiny moment, easy to miss, but Kate noticed. When they entered the ballroom, the noise swelled. Applause, camera shutters, the hum of conversation. Charlotte stayed close to her mother, her eyes darting around the room. She spotted photographers, dignitaries, and familiar faces from other events. She also noticed the seating arrangement. Camilla at the center, flanked by Charles on one side and a senior diplomat on the other. The symbolism was clear. Throughout the evening, Charlotte remained quietly observant. She listened to speeches, watched the way people reacted to Camilla, and caught snippets of conversation about how well she's doing in her role. The more she heard, the more her thoughts returned to Diana. The pivotal shift happened during the interlude before the final toasts. The master of ceremonies, perhaps prompted by someone behind the scenes, announced that it would be wonderful to hear a few words from the young princess about the importance of the evening. There was polite applause, a few smiles from guests, and an encouraging glance from Kate. William's expression was neutral, but his eyes followed Charlotte closely as she stood. This was the unscripted moment the staff had quietly inserted, but what no one expected was that Charlotte's mind was not on the cause, the charity, or even the gala itself. She was thinking of her grandmother. She was thinking of the difference between the woman she had learned about from stories and the woman who now sat as queen. When she reached the podium, she began as she had been taught, thanking the organizers, speaking clearly, smiling gently at the crowd. But the room fell even more silent when she paused, her gaze shifting to Camilla. It was not the long pause of someone forgetting their words. It was the pause of someone deciding whether to say them at all. What happened next would ripple through the family, the media, and the public for weeks to come. It was not part of any plan, but it was born from everything Charlotte had seen, heard, and felt. All the pieces that had been coming together behind closed doors. And when she spoke, she did so without hesitation, setting into motion the moment that would redefine the evening entirely. When Charlotte stepped up to the podium, she looked small against the grandeur of the stage. The carved wood gleamed under the lights, the microphone adjusted to her height, and the massive chandelier above her seemed to frame her like a portrait. She placed her hands lightly on the edges of the podium, her fingers steady. There was no visible tremor, no shuffling of feet. She had the composure of someone far older than her years. Her opening words were exactly what the audience expected. She thanked the guests for their generosity, spoke briefly about the charities they were there to support, and mentioned how proud she was to see so many people come together for good causes. Her voice carried clearly through the room, soft but confident, each syllable enunciated with the precision she had been taught. To most in the audience, it seemed like an adorable interlude, the youngest senior royal speaking in public, a moment designed to charm. Guests smiled warmly. A few took discreet photos. The king leaned slightly forward, his hands clasped, nodding faintly in encouragement. Kate kept her gaze fixed on her daughter, her expression calm but watchful. William's posture was rigid, not from disapproval, but from a father's instinctive readiness to step in if needed. Then came the pause. It was subtle at first, just a beat longer than a natural breath. Charlotte glanced down at the notes she had been given, but instead of continuing with the scripted remarks, she looked up and let her gaze sweep across the audience. Her eyes landed on Camilla, and she held that look. It was not the stare of a child seeking approval, nor of one intimidated by authority. It was level, direct, and deliberate. In that split second, the room seemed to shrink. Conversation stopped entirely. Even the sound of the orchestra tuning faintly in the background faded. Those who had attended countless royal events recognized the shift instantly. This was no longer a staged moment. This was something else entirely. When she spoke, her voice was calm, not loud, not trembling, but filled with a quiet certainty that made it carry even more weight. My grandma Diana deserved to be queen, not you. There was no preamble, no softening of the words. They landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the room that no one could stop. The immediate reaction was not an eruption, but a stunned stillness. It was the kind of silence that follows a truth spoken aloud when everyone knows it, but no one has dared to voice it. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of the foreign dignitaries blinked rapidly, as though unsure he had heard correctly. The cameras at the back of the room clicked more rapidly, their operators sensing they had just captured something historic. Camilla's reaction was almost imperceptible. Her hands remained folded neatly in her lap, but a faint tightening appeared at the corners of her mouth. She did not lower her gaze, nor did she attempt to smile. Her eyes stayed on Charlotte, but there was no warmth in them, only the careful, practiced neutrality of someone who had weathered storms before but had not expected this particular gust. William's reaction was harder to read. His eyes widened slightly, but he did not move to interrupt. Whether it was shock, pride, or concern that kept him rooted, no one could tell. Kate's lips pressed into a thin line, her gaze never wavering from her daughter. She didn't look away, didn't flinch, but there was an intensity in her eyes, as if she was willing Charlotte to remain steady. For Charlotte, the moment seemed to stretch endlessly, but in reality, it lasted only a few seconds. She let the words settle, then glanced briefly toward the rest of the audience. Without breaking composure, she thanked them again for supporting the evening's causes and stepped back from the microphone. Her walk back to her seat was measured, unhurried. She didn't look down or fidget with her dress. She simply returned to her place between her parents and sat, her chin slightly lifted. The silence lingered for another beat before the master of ceremonies, visibly caught off guard, offered a polite but shaky thank you, and quickly moved the program forward. The rest of the gala unfolded in its planned order, but nothing felt the same. Every applause sounded slightly off. Every exchange of smiles seemed more forced. Conversations at the tables were quieter, punctuated by sidelong glances at Charlotte and Camilla. The orchestra's music filled the air, but it could not mask the shift in the room's energy. In the press area at the back, photographers and reporters exchanged glances that needed no words. They knew what tomorrow's headlines would be. They had been handed a story far more potent than anything in the official program. Camilla, for the remainder of the evening, maintained her composure flawlessly. She engaged in polite conversation, raised her glass during toasts, and even offered a small laugh at one guest's remark. But those who watched closely saw the subtle signs. The way her fingers tapped lightly against the stem of her glass, the slight stiffness in her shoulders, the occasional faraway look in her eyes. For William and Kate, the challenge was to get through the rest of the night without feeding the moment further. They knew the cameras were watching for any sign, a smile, a frown, a whispered exchange, that could be interpreted as confirmation or denial of tension. They remained composed, engaging in light conversation with those around them, but their attention was never far from their daughter. Charlotte, for her part, seemed untroubled. She spoke politely to the guests who addressed her, smiled for photographs when asked, and listened to the remaining speeches without visible distraction. If she understood the magnitude of what she had done, she gave no sign of it in her demeanor. The evening ended with the customary mingling and slow dispersal of guests. Outside the palace, the night air was cool, and the line of waiting cars glinted under the street lamps. Inside, as the last of the guests departed, the family gathered briefly in a private room. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. No one addressed the moment directly. It was as if naming it too soon would make it more real. But the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with questions, implications, and the certainty that nothing, not the carefully planned gala, not the rehearsed speeches, not the tightly managed public image, would overshadow what had just taken place. The moment before the speech had been the last breath of the old evening. The moment after was the beginning of something entirely new. Charlotte's decision to speak those words had no build-up in her tone. There was no change in volume, no dramatic emphasis, just the steady, unflinching voice of a child who believed what she was saying. She looked directly at Camilla, her gaze level and unwavering. "My Grandma Diana deserved to be queen, not you." The sentence was short, but it was layered in ways the audience felt more than understood in that moment. It wasn't just a personal opinion. It was the echo of a public sentiment that had been whispered for decades, now spoken out loud in the most direct possible way. Not by a political commentator, not by a journalist, not by a royal critic, but by Diana's own granddaughter in a room full of the most powerful people in the country. When the words landed, there was a faint, collective sound, a sharp intake of breath, the almost imperceptible shifting of people in their chairs, the slight creak of the floor beneath the weight of poised bodies leaning forward or sitting straighter. It wasn't noisy, but it was audible enough to register as the physical reaction of a room realizing it had just witnessed something historic. Camilla's face was the first thing many people looked to. Her expression barely moved, but the tension was visible in the smallest of details. Her lips pressed together for a fraction of a second longer than usual. Her eyes, fixed on Charlotte, held still without blinking for 2 heartbeats. Then, with the subtlety of someone long trained in controlling her image, she shifted her gaze toward the audience, as though receiving the comment without dignifying it with a direct response. King Charles's reaction was harder to pin down. He did not flinch, nor did he look away from Charlotte. His hands remained clasped on the table, but there was a tightening in his jaw that was impossible to miss for those sitting close enough. He had lived through decades of public comparison between Diana and Camilla. He had heard the sentiment before, from the press, from the public, from politicians even, but never from within his own family, and certainly not in front of the world. William's reaction was one of contained energy. His eyes widened just slightly, then narrowed with focus, as if assessing whether his daughter had just made an innocent misstep or a deliberate statement. He didn't reach for her or speak, but his posture shifted. He leaned forward slightly, as though positioning himself to step in if the moment escalated. Kate, sitting to Charlotte's left, didn't move a muscle beyond a small breath she drew in, slow and deliberate. She was a master at absorbing tension without showing it, but there was no mistaking the flicker of something in her eyes. Not shock exactly, but the recognition that this was going to follow them long after the evening ended. Around the room, reactions varied. Some guests, particularly those who had admired Diana, allowed the corners of their mouths to twitch upward in the faintest of approving smiles. Others looked down at their hands, unwilling to make eye contact with anyone, as though watching might implicate them in the moment. Foreign dignitaries exchanged brief glances, silently calculating what this said about the monarchy's internal dynamics. The press photographers at the back began clicking furiously, their lenses trained on Camilla's face, Charlotte's profile, and the stillness of William and Kate. Charlotte, after delivering the sentence, didn't fidget or shrink back. She simply let the words hang in the air for a moment before returning to the last line of her prepared remarks, thanking the audience for supporting the charities represented that night. It was a return to the script, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted so dramatically that the words felt almost surreal, like someone turning a page in a book after a line that demanded the whole story stop. When she stepped back from the podium, the walk to her seat felt longer than it was. Every pair of eyes followed her. The click of her shoes against the stage floor was audible in the hushed room. She moved at a steady pace, not rushed, her chin lifted just enough to signal composure. The master of ceremonies, caught between the duty to keep the program moving and the knowledge that nothing could truly follow what had just happened, offered a polite thank you to Charlotte. His voice was slightly strained, as if trying to smooth over a crack in glass that had already splintered beyond repair. The applause that followed was hesitant. A few claps started here and there, then others joined in, not with enthusiasm, but with the kind of automatic politeness drilled into anyone who attends royal functions. It was the applause of people acknowledging that the moment had passed, but not quite knowing what it meant. Camilla's demeanor for the remainder of the evening became a study in control. She continued to engage with those around her, smiling when appropriate, speaking softly, and keeping her eyes away from the press cameras whenever possible. But there was a tautness in her posture, a deliberate effort in every movement. She had spent decades rebuilding her public image, and in one sentence, that work had been challenged in a way no journalist or public figure had managed. William kept his attention on the program, though every so often, his gaze would flick to Charlotte. There was no sign of reprimand in his expression, but neither was there open approval. His role in that moment was to absorb the shock and manage the damage later, away from the cameras. Kate remained the same, calm, smiling faintly when appropriate, her body angled slightly toward her daughter as though providing a silent buffer. The guests, once the program resumed, tried to settle back into the rhythm of the evening. The orchestra played, speakers came and went, toasts were made. But the words had already left the room and were making their way into the phones, notebooks, and memory cards of the press, into the minds of every guest, and inevitably, into the headlines of the next morning. The weight of the moment wasn't just in what had been said, but in who had said it, where it had been said, and how impossible it would be to walk it back. This wasn't gossip, speculation, or a leak. It was a direct statement, made publicly, that touched the deepest nerve of the monarchy's modern history. By the time the final applause of the night came, the room had regained some of its polish, but the undercurrent remained. The gala was officially a success by the metrics of attendance, fundraising, and media coverage. But privately, everyone who mattered knew that something far more significant had happened, something that would reverberate in conversations, strategy meetings, and family gatherings for months, perhaps years, to come. Chapter 8 takes us inside that strange, frozen space that followed Charlotte's words, a space in which Queen Camilla's silence became as loud and as telling as the statement itself. For all her decades of public life, Camilla had never faced a moment quite like this. She had been challenged in interviews, criticized in headlines, and dissected in documentaries, but always by journalists, commentators, or the public at large. Those could be dismissed, countered, or ignored. This, however, had come from inside the family, from a child, in the most public and formal of settings. From the moment Charlotte uttered the words, Camilla's body language entered a mode she had honed over years of scrutiny. She did not gasp, frown, or visibly react in any way that could be captured and magnified in tomorrow's papers. Her shoulders remained square, her hands still folded in her lap, her chin held at the same gentle angle. But the signs of strain were there for anyone who knew where to look. The first was in her eyes. For the briefest moment after the sentence fell into the room, they didn't blink. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was the instinctive stillness of someone caught off guard and processing what they've just heard. She kept her gaze fixed on Charlotte, and in that pause, a flicker of something unguarded passed through. Not quite shock, not quite anger, but a flash of recognition. It was as if she knew that the line was not an accident, that it carried the weight of a belief the child truly held. The second sign was in her mouth. Camilla's lips pressed together, not tightly enough to look overtly displeased, but firmly enough to suggest restraint. It was a micro-expression, a physical containment of words she would not allow herself to speak in that moment. She had been in enough public situations to know that silence, carefully held, can sometimes do less damage than an immediate response. Her hands remained in her lap, fingers interlaced, but close observers noticed the faintest movement of her right thumb brushing against her left knuckle, a small, rhythmic motion. It was the sort of unconscious action that comes when a person is trying to steady themselves without breaking the outward image of calm. Around her, the table remained unnaturally still. King Charles did not look at her. He kept his eyes on Charlotte for a moment longer before returning them to the stage. The diplomat to her right adjusted his cufflink unnecessarily, a tiny sign of discomfort at being seated so close to the epicenter of the evening's tension. Camilla's decision not to respond in any way, not even a polite smile toward Charlotte, was calculated. A direct acknowledgement would give the words more oxygen, feed the cameras, and make it harder for the palace to contain the narrative later. Instead, she turned her gaze slowly toward the master of ceremonies as the applause began, as though Charlotte's comment had been no more than a passing remark in a long night of speeches. But the silence she left in her wake was not empty. It was dense, almost heavy, filled with the things she could not say in public. In her mind, the night was suddenly no longer about the charities, the carefully orchestrated optics, or even the broader message of unity. It was about damage control. She knew the cameras had caught her face in the seconds after Charlotte spoke. She also knew that no matter how well she had masked her reaction, those images would be dissected frame by a public that still held Diana's memory close. She also understood, perhaps more acutely than anyone else in the room, how symbolic the moment was. In the court of public opinion, the innocence of a child often carries more weight than the practiced words of an adult. People would see Charlotte not as a scheming figure, but as someone too young to be anything but truthful. That truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken. The orchestra began to play softly as the next part of the program moved forward, but Camilla's mind wasn't on the music. She was cataloging her next steps. Maintain composure for the rest of the night, avoid unnecessary interactions with the press afterward, and coordinate with her communications team before morning. She would need to decide whether to ignore the comment entirely or to subtly address it in some future appearance without drawing further attention. What she could not control, and what gnawed at her as she lifted her glass for the next toast, was the reaction beyond those palace walls. She knew that, even now, guests were drafting mental versions of the moment to tell their friends. Journalists were already sending texts to their editors, and social media posts were beginning to circulate. By the time she awoke the next morning, the comment would be everywhere. Her silence during the remainder of the evening became a shield. She spoke when addressed, smiled for photographs, and made the rounds of polite conversation, but she did not volunteer opinions or insert herself into any conversations that could be twisted into a response to Charlotte's remark. For someone used to navigating delicate social situations, this was not a challenge in the ordinary sense, but the knowledge that every glance, every gesture, was being recorded made it more exhausting than usual. Across the room, Charlotte appeared calm, engaged in small exchanges with her mother, and occasionally smiling when guests approached. If Camilla expected to see a flicker of regret or nervousness, she found none. That, in its own way, was more disquieting than the words themselves. As the night drew to a close and the royal party began to leave, Camilla held her composure until they were well away from the public eye. In the privacy of the palace's inner rooms, where only trusted aides and family could enter, she allowed her expression to shift slightly. The neutral mask softened, revealing the tightness in her jaw and the faint crease between her brows. Even then, she didn't speak of the remark. Not to Charles, not to her aides, not to anyone. To speak of it immediately would risk letting her own emotions guide her response, and Camilla had learned long ago that emotion was a dangerous currency in the public arena. Instead, she filed it away, not forgotten, not forgiven, but stored for the moment when it would need to be addressed in a way that preserved her position and dignity. But silence, as controlled as it was that night, had its own cost. It left a vacuum for others to fill. And by the time the palace woke the next morning, that vacuum would be overflowing with interpretations, opinions, and narratives, many of them not in Camilla's favor.